In November and December of 1994, Sega released both the 32X and the Sega Saturn. Both of these were 32-bit consoles. To make matters even more confusing, they were planning on releasing a Sega Neptune and Sega Pluto console later on, and both of those were also going to be 32 bits. To me, this was sort of the beginning of Sega's downfall as a console manufacturer. So today we're going to take a look at these four consoles and try to answer the question. Sega, what the hell were you thinking? In late 1993, Hayao Nakayama, CEO of Sega of Japan at the time, asked his company to create a new 32-bit video game console to take the company forward past the 16-bit era. This resulted in 4 separate 32-bit projects being placed into development during 1994. The Sega Saturn, a cartridge-only version of the Saturn called the Sega Jupiter, the Sega Neptune, and Project Mars. If that's not enough 32-bit consoles in development for you, we're going to add one more before our story is done. Sega of Japan engineers had originally designed Project Mars as a new, completely separate console that would be called the Genesis 2. The Genesis 2 would feature twice the amount of colors as the original Genesis and at a lower price point. Sega of Japan's engineers met with Sega of America to collaborate on the console. Engineers from Sega of America were not impressed. One executive went as far as to say that it was a terrible idea since it was just an enhancement to an existing console. He suggested instead that it become an add-on for the Genesis, and the 32X was born.
The machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32X.
North American marketing pitched the 32X as being 40 times more powerful than the Super Nintendo and 6 times more powerful than the 3DO. This was pretty much true. We won't go over all of the specs here, but the 3DO, one of, if not the most powerful console in the West, could render 20,000 textured polygons a second at a time. On the PC side of things, a Pentium 60 could render 30 to 50,000 flat shaded polygons a second and 6,000 textured polygons a second at one time. The 32X could render 160,000 flat shaded polygons and 50,000 textured polygons a second at one time. The 32X was generally the most powerful home system released to the Western world in 1994. The plan was to make the 32X a device which could be attached to the Genesis, similar to the power-based converter, allowing the system to play a new set of upgraded 32-bit cartridge games and 32-bit Mega CD games while still maintaining backwards compatibility with the Genesis software and peripherals. Sega of America shocked the gaming world by revealing its own 32-bit Mars system, now known as the 32X, at its first specially planned press-only Sega Gamers Day event in June of 1994. Sega promised 32-bit gaming by the end of the year. Sega wanted this to be a triumphant announcement, but it wasn't, and the press knew it. Once the 32X became an add-on, its production had been moved over from Japan to Sega of America, independently from the Saturn and Jupiter projects that were taking place in Japan. This was an obvious sign of Sega of Japan's lack of interest in the 32X, and this was a problem. Publicly announced at Winter CES 1993, the Sega Saturn caught the public's attention. The Saturn was already expected to be the CD-based successor to the Genesis/Mega Drive, with the Sega Jupiter also in development to act as a cheaper alternative to the Saturn. The Jupiter would be a cartridge-only based version of the Saturn with similar specs, but incompatible with CD-based games, without a planned Sega Saturn CD add-on. The standard Saturn itself was originally designed to run both cartridge and disc-based software. Slowly but surely, information about the Saturn began to leak out. It was rumored to be a 32-bit machine running on a single NEC V60-esque processor clocked at 27 MHz. Suggested specifications included a palette of 16.7 million colors, an alpha channel for sprites, and the capability of displaying and animating over 16,000 polygons on screen at once, equivalent to 480,000 polygons per second at 30 frames per second. By February of 1994, talk of the Saturn was well underway, with developers supposedly receiving extremely early hardware, reported to be vastly superior to the Amiga CD32, Atari Jaguar, and 3DO. Tom Kalinske, the president of Sega of America at the time, was never impressed with Sega of Japan's plans for the Sega Saturn. Kalinske felt that the Saturn would not sell well in North America in its current form because it was not engineered in a way that would appeal to Western developers. He feared that this could result in a seriously detrimental lack of titles, especially at launch. Unfortunately, Sega of Japan wouldn't allow Sega of America to have a say in regards to the development of the Saturn. Sega of Japan's unwillingness to accept ideas or input from Sega of America didn't end there. Just before Saturn's development began in Japan, Sony turned to Sega of America as a possible partner to get into the console race. Sega of America was impressed by Sony's PlayStation project and presented Sega of Japan with a proposal to create a Sony Sega CD-based console. Sega of Japan rejected the idea. Sony had already been rejected by Nintendo in favor of Philips, so Sega was their last real option left besides producing a console on their own. By refusing Sega of America's idea, Sega of Japan inadvertently created a competitor more dangerous than Nintendo in many ways. This competitor wasn't trying to take the number one spot from Nintendo. It was trying to take Sega's. In the US, the 32X was released in November of 1994, well before the Saturn's US release in May of 1995. On the surface, this makes sense. After all, the Saturn was supposed to be the more powerful successor to the 32X, and while 6 months between system releases may seem a bit rushed, the 32X was designed to be more of a low-cost transitional add-on to extend the capabilities and life of the Genesis. That's what makes what happened in Japan puzzling. In Japan, the Saturn was actually released before the 32X. To make matters worse, they were released within 2 weeks of each other, with the Saturn hitting store shelves November 22nd of 1994 and the 32X going on sale on December 3rd. In North America, the 32X add-on was actually well received initially by the gaming press once it was released. 350,000 consoles were shipped in North America in the first 3 weeks. Within 2 months of sale, Sega claimed that the 32X had sold out the much-hyped 3DO, and the 32X began to show potential as a long-term console/hybrid add-on. Shortly after its release, the cracks began to show. Games were being rushed to the market and frequently came with errors in programming. Users began to realize that the 32X conversions of games like Doom were lacking levels, and their audio quality wasn't doing justice to the original musical score. Complaints that the 32X was not working with consumers' particular version of the Genesis or their television started coming in. This forced Sega to give away adapters. The complications of the Sega Mega CD 32X setup also failed to win over the small Sega CD fanbase. Some early titles like the arcade conversions of Star Wars Arcade and Virtua Racing Deluxe succeeded at first, but the next wave of first-party titles such as the Panned Motocross Championship and conversions of the aging Space Harrier and Afterburner cast doubts over the 32X's appeal and capabilities. Sega of Japan required that the 32X's architecture be similar to that of the Saturn's. While that may have led to reductions in costs, it had other consequences. Just as Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske predicted, the unappealing architecture of the Saturn brought a drought of games and only limited support from third-party Western developers, with little on the horizon for the second half of 1995. As early as January, 32X consoles were being returned to retailers. Many of these returns were the result of the publicized but ultimately cancelled Sega Neptune project, set to combine the 32X and Genesis systems into one. That would be our fifth 32-bit Sega console in development. The Neptune was going to retail for less than $200 and include a pack-in game, set to be the 32X port of Virtua Fighter. The Neptune represented a far better value than the combined cost of a new Genesis system at $100, a 32X at $150, and the standard price for a 32X title of $70. So, Sega cannibalized their own 32X sales for a console they publicized but never actually released. In March of 1995, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn would be released in the US on Saturn Day, Saturday, September 2nd, 1995. However, Sega of Japan wanted an early launch to give the Saturn an advantage over the PlayStation, so at the first E3 Expo ever, on May 11th of 1995, Kalinske gave a keynote speech for the upcoming Saturn in which he revealed that the Saturn would include Virtua Fighter as the pack-in game and retail for $399. Kalinske also revealed that, due to high consumer demand, Sega had already shipped 30,000 Saturns to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software Etc. for immediate release. This announcement upset retailers who were not informed of the surprise release, including Best Buy and Walmart. KB Toys responded by dropping Sega from its lineup altogether. Sony subsequently unveiled the retail price for the PlayStation when Sony Computer Entertainment America president Steve Race took the stage and simply said,
$299.
and then walked off the stage to applause. To be fair, the Sega Saturn and the 32X were not Sega's last consoles. In 1998, Sega released the Dreamcast, a console that's beloved even to this day. The problem is that it was a commercial failure as well. In my opinion, due in large part to the bad taste that people still had in their mouths from the 32X, the Saturn, and even the announcements of the Neptune and Pluto. Now, I'm not trying to say that the Sega Saturn and the 32X completely killed off Sega as a console manufacturer, but they did fire the first and strongest shot. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please let me know in the comments. And hey, while you're at it, why don't you subscribe?